If you wandered through the streets of Miami, Florida in the mid-1970s, you would have seen a strange phenomenon that confused the locals and thrilled the shopkeepers. The finest jewelry stores, the luxury car dealerships, and the high-end electronics shops were not crowded with American millionaires or Arab oil sheikhs or European aristocrats. They were packed with Venezuelans. They were everywhere. They were loud, they were joyful, and they were astonishingly rich. They moved in packs, families of 10 or 12, sweeping through the malls of Florida like conquering armies. They had a nickname among the merchants of the Sunshine State. They were called Dame Dos. That expression translates simply as, "Give me two." Because when a Venezuelan liked a pair of Italian shoes, he did not buy one pair. He said, "Give me two, one for me and one for my friend." When he bought a color television, the marvel of the era, he said, "Give me two, one for the living room and one for the bathroom." They paid in cash. They carried suitcases full of United States dollars, crisp and new, smelling of the bank vaults of Caracas. They bought condos in Brickell and mansions in Coral Gables without asking the price. They tipped waiters with $100 bills. To the average American struggling with the recession and inflation of the Carter years, these visitors looked like they had arrived from another planet, a planet made of gold. Back in Caracas, the skyline was transforming before the eyes of the world. It was a city of construction cranes and neon lights, a concrete jungle rising faster than any other city in the hemisphere. It was the only city in South America where the Concorde, the supersonic jet serving the global elite, landed regularly. You could fly from Paris to Caracas in 3 hours, arriving in time for a champagne lunch at a French restaurant in Altamira that served lobster flown in that very morning from Maine. The shops in the Sabana Grande district sold the latest fashions from Milan and Paris before they even appeared in New York or London. Whiskey consumption per capita in Venezuela was the highest in the world. They drank 18-year-old scotch as if it were water. It was a party that appeared endless. It was the era known as Saudi Venezuela. To grasp this moment of madness, this fever dream of consumption and abundance, it is necessary to understand the illusion. The world looked at Venezuela and saw a miracle. Observers saw a South American nation that had somehow cracked the code of development. It had a stable democracy where power changed hands peacefully every 5 years. It had a growing middle class that owned cars and homes, and above all, it had oil, rivers of oil, oceans of oil. But what seemed like a miracle was actually a trap. It was a golden cage being built bar by the global financial system. And the people locked inside that cage were too drunk on cheap gasoline and expensive scotch to realize the door was closing. The story of the Saudi era does not begin in Caracas, but thousands of miles away in the deserts of the Middle East. In October 1973, the Yom Kippur War broke out. The Arab oil-producing nations, enraged by Western support for Israel, declared an oil embargo. They turned off the tap. The price of oil did not just rise. It exploded. It quadrupled almost overnight. It surged from $3 a barrel to $12 a barrel in what felt like the blink of an eye. It was the largest transfer of wealth in human history. Money flowed like a tidal wave from the industrial economies of the United States and Europe into the coffers of the OPEC states. Venezuela was a founding member of OPEC. In fact, the very concept of OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, was largely the creation of a Venezuelan visionary named Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso. He was a brilliant yet austere figure who drove a small car and read by candlelight to save electricity. Years earlier, he had warned his fellow citizens that oil was the devil's excrement. He said it brings trouble, it brings waste, it brings corruption. He predicted that a sudden flood of unearned wealth would rot the soul of the nation. But in 1974, almost no one was listening to the warnings of a grim old man. People were listening to the ringing of cash registers. The president of Venezuela at that time was a man named Carlos Andrés Pérez, known to all simply as Cap. He was a charismatic, high-energy populist who walked quickly, talked even faster, and wore loud plaid jackets. He took office in 1974 just as the tsunami of petrodollars crashed onto Venezuelan shores. He found himself in a situation no leader in history had ever truly faced. He had too much money. The treasury was overflowing. The central bank literally did not have enough vault space to hold the international reserves. They had to stack sacks of dollars in the corridors of the Ministry of Finance. Carlos Andrés Pérez announced that Venezuela would use this fortune to become a first world nation within a single decade. He popularized the slogan, Gran Venezuela, the Great Venezuela. His plan was audacious. He intended to nationalize the oil industry, which was still controlled by American giants like Exxon and Shell. He wanted to build a massive steel industry in the jungle to rival Pittsburgh. He hoped to construct the largest hydroelectric dam on Earth. He promised a scholarship for every student who wished to study overseas. He wanted to transform Venezuela into a modern industrial power that would lead Latin America into the 21st century. And for a few years, it looked as if the vision might succeed. The government launched the Gran Mariscal de Ayacucho Scholarship Program. Tens of thousands of young Venezuelans were sent to elite universities in the United States and Europe completely free of charge. They were the sons and daughters of mechanics and housekeepers studying at Harvard, Oxford, and the Sorbonne. It was a noble dream, a massive bet on human capital intended to secure the future. But beneath that dream, the economy was decaying. This is where the idea of Dutch disease appears. When a country experiences a huge influx of foreign currency, like dollars from oil exports, its local currency becomes very strong. The Venezuelan bolivar was pegged to the dollar at a rate of 4.30. It was considered solid as a rock. Anyone could walk into a bank in Caracas with bolívares and walk out with dollars, no questions asked. But because the bolivar was so strong, importing goods became extremely cheap, while producing goods at home became extremely costly. Why would a Venezuelan farmer grow corn when he could import corn from Iowa for half the price? Why would a factory in Valencia manufacture shoes when designer footwear from Italy could be imported for pennies? The productive apparatus of the nation started to wither. Agriculture collapsed. Fields were abandoned. Farmers migrated to the cities, settling in shanty towns and living on government handouts. Venezuela stopped making things and started buying things. The country imported everything. It imported eggs. It imported clothes. It imported cars. It even imported the sand used to build its concrete skyscrapers because, apparently, Venezuelan sand was not considered good enough. This was the first part of the trap, the addiction to imports. The second part was far more dangerous: debt. A natural question arises. Why would a country swimming in cash need to borrow money? This is the great paradox of the 1970s. The oil riches that poured into Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and other producers had to be parked somewhere. These states could not spend it fast enough, so they deposited it in the safest places they knew: big banks on Wall Street and in the City of London, Citibank, Chase Manhattan, Bank of America, and others. Those banks suddenly sat on mountains of cash deposited by the oil nations. They faced a problem. A bank does not earn profit by merely holding money. It earns profit by lending money. They needed borrowers for these billions. But the United States economy was in deep recession. American businesses were weak and not eager to borrow. So the bankers turned their eyes south. They examined Latin America, and especially Venezuela. They saw a country with a stable democracy and the largest known oil reserves in the Western Hemisphere. They saw the perfect client. Bankers in expensive suits flew from New York to Caracas on the Concorde. They stayed at luxury hotels drinking scotch and meeting with government ministers. They carried briefcases stuffed with loan documents. They did not wait for the Venezuelan government to request funds. They begged officials to accept them. They sold a dream. They said, "Look, oil prices will rise forever. Today oil is $12 a barrel. Tomorrow it will be 20, then 50, then 100. If you borrow $1 billion today, inflation and higher oil prices will wipe out the debt. It is free money. It is leverage." The Venezuelan government, led by Carlos Andrés Pérez, swallowed the pitch whole. They began borrowing frantically. They borrowed to pay for enormous infrastructure projects that were blowing past their budgets. They borrowed to subsidize imports so citizens could keep buying cheap whiskey and televisions. They borrowed to cover the corruption that was draining the treasury. The corruption was monumental. When that much money flows through a system without real checks and balances, it sticks to people's hands. Government contracts were granted to friends of the ruling party. Phantom companies were established to receive loans that were never repaid. A cut was taken on every barrel of oil sold and every ton of steel purchased. People spoke of the age of the 12 apostles, a reference to the dozen business tycoons who became billionaires simply by staying close to the president. They built palaces in Caracas and bought islands in the Caribbean. But the most insidious aspect of the borrowing lay in the loan terms. The bankers were not naive. They knew the boom might not last. So they wrote the contracts using floating interest rates. That meant the interest Venezuela paid was not fixed. It was tied to the United States prime rate or the London interbank rate. If interest rates in the United States rose, Venezuela's payments would rise as well. Almost nobody in Caracas paid attention to this fine print. In the mid-70s, United States interest rates were low. Money was cheap. The party rolled on. The government built the Guri Dam, one of the great engineering achievements of the world, providing electricity to nearly the entire country. They built the Caracas Metro, a gleaming subway system cleaner and more modern than the New York subway. They created the vast industrial complex of Ciudad Guayana in the middle of the jungle. They nationalized the oil industry in 1976, creating PDVSA, the state oil company. On that day, they raised the Venezuelan flag over the oil fields and proclaimed economic independence. But it was an empty independence. By the end of the decade, Venezuela had the highest per capita external debt on the planet. The country owed billions to the very same banks that held its oil deposits. The nation was recycling its own wealth, paying interest for the privilege of accessing its own money. It was a shell game on a global scale. Society itself began to change. The culture of hard work and thrift that had defined older generations of Venezuelans evaporated. It was replaced by a culture of easy money. If you needed a job, you did not look to the private sector. You looked to the state. The bureaucracy swelled to grotesque dimensions. There were elevator operators for automatic elevators. There were gardeners for gardens that did not exist. There were consultants who never produced any consultation. Everyone was on the payroll. The state became father, mother, and employer of the entire nation, and the illusion of prosperity masked deep inequality. While the middle class flew to Miami, the poor in the ranchos, the slums clinging to the hillsides, watched the skyline grow but saw little benefit. They received subsidies. Yes, gasoline was cheaper than water. You could fill the tank of a huge American gas guzzler for the price of a stick of gum. Bread was kept artificially cheap, but their schools were collapsing and their hospitals were failing. The money was being spent on concrete and imports, not on people. The gulf between the Venezuela of country clubs and the Venezuela of the barrios widened every day. As the 1970s drew to a close, warning lights flashed red. The global oil market was becoming saturated. New oil fields in the North Sea and Alaska were coming online, weakening OPEC's grip. Demand for oil was falling as Western countries became more energy efficient. The price of oil stopped climbing. It began to wobble. In 1979, a new president, Luis Herrera Campins, took office. In his inaugural speech, after reviewing the nation's finances, he uttered a phrase that should have terrified everyone. He said he was inheriting a mortgaged country. He saw the books. He saw the debt. He saw that spending was unsustainable. He saw that for every dollar flowing in, $2 were going out. But he could not halt the machine. The inertia of spending was too strong. The political price of austerity was too high. People were hooked on subsidies. The dame dues mentality was embedded in the national psyche. Citizens believed wealth was their natural condition. So instead of cutting back, the government doubled down. They borrowed more money just to pay the interest on the old loans. They played a game of musical chairs, praying the music would never stop. But the music was about to end. In Washington, D.C., a man named Paul Volcker became chairman of the Federal Reserve. He was a towering figure with a cigar and a mission. His mission was to kill inflation in the United States. To do that, he was about to take action that would shatter the Venezuelan dream. He would raise interest rates to levels the modern economy had never seen. At the end of the first act of this story, Venezuela stands on the edge of a cliff. It is 1979. The nightclubs of Caracas are packed. The highways are jammed with American cars. The government is spending as if there is no tomorrow. Banks in New York are counting their profits. But the trap is set. The floating interest rates are ticking time bombs. The oil price is softening. And the country that imagines it is richer than the United States is about to learn it is a debtor living on borrowed time. In the second act, the crash arrives. The year is 1981, and the trap is about to snap shut. In the United States, the Federal Reserve Chairman, Paul Volcker, takes a decision that will shake the foundations of the global economy. To crush runaway dollar inflation that is eating the American economy alive, he drives interest rates up to around 20%. It is shock therapy for the United States. Harsh, but necessary. For Venezuela, it is a death sentence. Remember the fine print in those loans? The floating rates? Overnight, interest payments on Venezuela's huge foreign debt doubled and then tripled. The country had borrowed billions when money cost around 5%. Now it had to service those debts at something near 20%. At precisely the same moment, the oil market collapsed. A global oil glut drove prices down. The perfect storm had arrived. Expenses were soaring as income plunged. The vise tightened. For a few years, the government tried to conceal reality. Officials burned through reserves to prop up the currency. They maintained the bolivar's peg at 4.30 to the dollar. They wanted to preserve the illusion of Saudi Venezuela. They wanted the middle class to keep flying to Miami. They wanted the scotch to keep flowing. But mathematics cannot be cheated. The central bank was hemorrhaging dollars. Every day, millions left the country as nervous investors and wealthy Venezuelans shifted their assets to accounts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. It was capital flight on an industrial scale. The people who had gained the most from the boom, the so-called apostles of development, were the first to abandon ship, taking their fortunes with them. Then came the reckoning. Friday, February 18th, 1983. That date is burned into the memory of every Venezuelan. It is known simply as Viernes Negro, Black Friday. That morning, the government finally admitted defeat. Officials announced that they could no longer defend the currency. The bolivar was devalued. The iconic rate of 4.30, the symbol of stability for decades, vanished in an instant. A complex system of multiple exchange rates was introduced, but the underlying truth was brutal. The currency crashed. Imagine waking up and discovering that your savings have lost half their value overnight. Imagine being a business owner with debts in dollars, and suddenly your obligations have tripled in local terms. Imagine being a scholarship student in London, relying on government funds, and suddenly the payment never arrives, your credit card stops working, and you are evicted from your apartment. The psychological shock was enormous. The era of Dom Dos ended that morning. Concorde flights were canceled. Shopping binges in Miami ceased. The Venezuelan middle class, which had felt rich and untouchable, suddenly felt poor and exposed. The party ended, and the lights came on, revealing a room full of broken glass and unpaid bills. The hangover had begun. But the financial crash was only the start of the suffering. The 1980s became known across Latin America as the lost decade. For Venezuela, it was a slow, grinding descent into poverty. The government was effectively bankrupt. International banks would no longer lend because they knew Venezuela could not repay. In fact, the banks now viewed Caracas as an adversary. Here, the twist of the banking system reveals itself. The same American banks that had practically forced loans on Venezuela in the 1970s were now demanding repayment with pitiless aggression. They sent teams of lawyers and accountants to Caracas. They insisted the government slash social spending. They insisted subsidies be eliminated. They insisted state assets be sold. They showed no interest in the suffering of the Venezuelan people. They cared only about the solvency of their balance sheets. The smiling bankers with briefcases were replaced by grim auditors with calculators. The Venezuelan government tried to negotiate. It refinanced the debt again and again. But every refinancing came with strings attached. Every condition brought new pain for ordinary citizens. The grand infrastructure built during the boom began to decay. Roads developed potholes large enough to swallow cars. Hospitals ran out of medicine and equipment failed. Schools fell into ruin. The great Venezuela crumbled before people's eyes. By 1988, the situation was desperate. The man who had overseen the boom, Carlos Andrés Pérez, decided to run for president once more. He campaigned on nostalgia. He reminded voters of the good times. He promised to restore abundance. He danced on stage and waved his arms. The electorate, starved for hope, believed him. They returned him to power in a landslide. Many thought that simply having him back in the palace would make oil prices climb and dollars reappear. They imagined he had a magic wand. But when Cap returned to office in 1989, he found the cupboards bare. There was no money. International reserves were essentially zero. he had no real choice. He had to turn to the lender of last resort, the International Monetary Fund. The IMF offered a rescue package, a loan of about $4.5 billion to stabilize the economy. But the IMF is not a charity. It demanded a strict structural adjustment program. This turnaround plan was called El Gran Viraje, the Great Turn. The package required the government to lift price controls on goods. It required the privatization of state-owned firms. And most explosively, it required the removal of the gasoline subsidy. For Venezuelans, cheap fuel was a birthright, the one tangible benefit they felt they received from living in an oil-rich country. Raising fuel prices was taboo, the third rail of politics. Yet Carlos Andrés Pérez, trapped by debt and bankers, accepted the terms. He went on television and told citizens that sacrifice was necessary for the future. On February 27, 1989, the new prices took effect. Gasoline prices rose, and with them, the cost of public transportation. Bus drivers increased their fares. People in the commuter towns around Caracas woke up to go to work and discovered they could no longer afford the ride. A small protest began in the town of Guarenas. People shouted, they burned tires. And then, like a spark falling into a pool of gasoline, the anger ignited. The unrest spread to Caracas. People descended from the ranchos into the city center. But this was not a peaceful political march. It was a riot. It became known as El Caracazo. For 3 days, Caracas burned. People looted supermarkets, electronics stores, and shopping malls. They were taking back what they felt had been stolen from them. They were seizing the symbols of Saudi Venezuela that they could no longer buy. They carried sides of beef and television sets on their shoulders. It was the fury of a population that had been promised paradise and handed purgatory. The government panicked. The police were overwhelmed. Carlos Andrés Pérez, once hailed as a hero of the people, suspended constitutional guarantees. He sent the army into the streets and gave the order to fire. The repression was savage. Soldiers with automatic weapons shot into crowds. They shot into shanty towns. They fired indiscriminately. The official death toll hovered around a few hundred, but human rights groups believe the real number may have been in the thousands. Bodies were buried in mass graves. El Caracazo shattered the bond between the public and the democratic system. It destroyed the legitimacy of the traditional parties. It demolished the myth of Venezuelan exceptionalism. The illusion of the 1970s had led directly to the massacre of the 1980s. Wealth had been a trap. By borrowing against the future, Venezuela had mortgaged its stability. The United States-centered banking system profited on the way up, collecting huge fees for arranging loans and holding deposits. It profited again on the way down, protected by IMF bailouts that squeezed the Venezuelan people to ensure interest payments. The psychological scar of this period is impossible to overstate. It generated a deep resentment toward the United States and toward capitalism itself. People felt deceived. They believed the nation's wealth had been plundered by a conspiracy of foreign bankers and corrupt local elites. They looked at rusting skeletons of unfinished construction and saw monuments to theft. They looked at politicians and saw liars. In that landscape of ruin and fury, a young military officer named Hugo Chavez spotted his opportunity. 3 years after El Caracazo, in 1992, he led a coup attempt. He failed militarily, but he succeeded politically. He told the people the system was rotten. He told them the oil wealth belonged to them. He channeled both nostalgia for lost riches and rage at betrayal. When he spoke, he was not only talking about politics, he was speaking to the broken promise of the Saudi era. Saudi Venezuela proved that money is not the same as wealth. Wealth is productivity. Wealth is education. Wealth is strong institutions. Venezuela had money, but lacked the institutions to manage it. The country suffered the resource curse in its most brutal form. Oil made the state independent of society. The government did not need taxes from citizens, so it did not need to listen to citizens. It only needed to satisfy international oil markets and international bankers. When those markets turned, and those bankers turned, the state crumbled. The tragedy of the damn-dose generation is that they believed they were building a modern nation, but in reality, they were spending an inheritance on a party. They awoke to a hangover that has lasted roughly 4 decades. Today, if you visit Caracas, You can still see remnants of that time. You can see futuristic architecture from the 1970s, now stained and decaying. You can see the skeletal frames of buildings never completed, standing like tombstones. And in the memories of the older generation, you can still find the image of the Concorde landing at Maiquetía Airport and the Venezuelan Bolivar being the envy of the world. But it is a bitter memory. They now understand that the apparent wealth was not real. It was a loan taken out against their children's future. The installments on that loan are still being paid, in poverty, in migration, and in the destruction of a country that once dreamed of becoming the great Venezuela. The banks got their money, the politicians got their kickbacks, the people got the bill. And the price was everything they possessed. The tale of Saudi Venezuela is the story of Icarus flying too close to the sun on wings made of oil and borrowed dollars, only to plunge into the sea.